Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past. Today's video is a biography of Queen Elizabeth II, who passed away aged 96 on the 8th of September 2022. As a sign of respect for Her Majesty, you may notice a few things about this video which are slightly different to my normal fare. I'll be foregoing the normal startup music as I think it's too jaunty for a video about someone who has died so recently, nor will there be any info cards, end screen, or in-video promotions of my other videos or online outlets, or affiliate links in the description box. The video does still have adverts in it, as I'm afraid I'm not in a financial position to work for free for a week putting this video together, and I hope you can understand my position in that respect. Regarding the images and footage used in this video, one of the reasons I so rarely look at modern history on my channel is that most visual sources from the past century or so are still under copyright. And while I think I've overcome that problem here, I've managed it by using a lot of material from non-UK archives. So please excuse how many images you're about to see of the Queen on foreign trips and with foreign dignitaries. Given Her Majesty's long life, I won't be able to cover absolutely everything that happened to her, but I hope you enjoy my selection of what I think were her key moments. Okay, with all that in mind, let's get started. On the 21st of April 1926, the London Gazette made the following announcement. This morning, at 20 minutes before 3 o'clock, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York was safely delivered of a princess at 17 Bruton Street, Mayfair, which was knocked down in 1937, so we just have the plaques you see here now. His Royal Highness the Duke of York and the Countess of Strathmore were present. Secretary Sir William Johnson Hicks was also present. The presence of a senior politician was a long-standing tradition with royal births to ensure the baby was really the royal progeny and not an imposter child smuggled in. Her Royal Highness and the infant princess are doing perfectly well. The happy event was made known by the firing of the Park and Tower guns. This was how many in the world came to learn that Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary of York had arrived. Her father was Prince Albert, Duke of York, who was known as Bertie within the family, and who was the second son of the reigning monarch King George V and his wife Mary of Teck. Her mother was the former Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, daughter of the Earl of Strathmore, and it was at her parents' home that her daughter was born. The birth had been tricky, and the Duchess ended up needing a C-section, but as the Gazette said, everything was well afterwards. The princess was later baptised on the 29th of May at Buckingham Palace, and as she grew a little bigger and began to talk, she inadvertently gave herself a nickname. For being unable to say Elizabeth right away, she instead called herself Lilibet, a name which would stay with her within the family for the rest of her life. Princess Elizabeth was not an only child for particularly long, as she was joined in the nursery by her sister, Princess Margaret Rose, in 1930. Together, the girls were raised and educated at home by their governess and a series of tutors, which was perfectly normal practice for girls of their rank at this point in time. And among other things, she was taught to speak excellent French. The family was a close unit who Bertie referred to as We Four. And it was in 1933 that her famous love of corgi dogs was instituted, when the sisters requested and were given two such dogs named Jane and Doogie. She also developed a love of horses and riding, which would stay with her for the rest of her life. At the time of her birth, Elizabeth was third in line for the throne, behind her uncle, Prince Edward, known as David by his family, but I'm going to continue calling him Edward for clarity's sake, and her father. Despite her proximity to the crown, however, it was not supposed that she would ever take it, the expectation being that her uncle would marry and produce children who would supplant her. Indeed, had her parents ever had a boy, that too would have prevented her becoming queen. No baby brother made an appearance, though, and in 1936 a series of events unfolded which would change Elizabeth's entire destiny. On the 20th of January, King George V, who Elizabeth referred to as Grandpa England, died. Prince Edward now became King Edward VIII, but there was a serious problem looming. Still unmarried, Edward had fallen in love with an American woman named Wallis Simpson, who had been divorced once and was then in the process of divorcing again. She was not viewed as suitable queen consort material, especially given Edward's position as head of the Church of England, and, under pressure to either give up her or the crown, he abdicated on the 11th of December that same year, going on to marry Wallis in France in 1937. The couple would, from then on, be known as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Elizabeth's father, who had never expected or wanted the crown, now found himself the new king, taking the regnal name of George VI, and Elizabeth became the heiress presumptive. From living a fairly quiet life at their home at 145 Piccadilly, Elizabeth and her family had to move into Buckingham Palace and take on the roles and responsibilities of being the country's most senior royals. Worse was to come for the family, and indeed the world, for in 1939 World War II began. There was talk of sending Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret abroad for safety, but as their mother said, they would go nowhere without her, she wasn't leaving without the king, and he would never abandon his country. The entire family therefore stayed in England, with the girls evacuated to Windsor Castle for the majority of the war, a precaution which proved wise as Buckingham Palace was bombed in 1940 and her parents only narrowly escaped injury. It was from Windsor Castle in October 1940 that she gave her first ever radio address. It was part of the BBC's Children's Hour, and the 14-year-old Elizabeth told her fellow evacuees that thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those you love most of all. To you living in new surroundings, we send a message of true sympathy, and at the same time we would like to thank the kind people who have welcomed you to their homes in the country. By the later stages of the war, Elizabeth was no longer a child, and after turning 18 in 1944, she enlisted in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. There she learned how to drive and work as a mechanic, as these images show. When the war in Europe finally ended on the 8th of May 1945, she and her sister waved to the London crowds from the balcony of Buckingham Palace 6 separate times with their parents, before joining the throngs celebrating in the city incognito, where they had the unusual experience of cheering the King and Queen on the balcony as spectators. Elizabeth recalled the moment in an audio interview in later life, saying, "I remember we were terrified of being recognised, so I pulled my uniform cap well down over my eyes. I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall, all of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief. I think it was one of the most memorable nights of my life." If you'd like to hear the audio of the Queen discussing that day, see the link in the description box under this video. With it now clear that she was not going to be supplanted in the line of succession by a brother, Elizabeth began to look to her future as Queen, though I'm sure she thought it was still much further away than it actually was. To that end, on her 21st birthday in 1947, and whilst staying in Cape Town during her first overseas tour with her family, she made a famous speech in which she said, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service, and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong." It was a promise she would keep. 1947 was also a momentous year, as it marked the announcement of the princess's engagement, then her marriage, to her distant cousin, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, who she had known since childhood. Given that Philip was, by royal standards, a penniless exile who had had to flee the country of his birth as a baby in an orange crate, there were reservations within the royal household about his suitability to marry the princess. But Elizabeth stuck to her guns and got her love match. The couple were married in Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November that year, with Philip having already renounced his birth titles, taken the surname Mountbatten, and been created His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. Elizabeth would therefore be known over the next few years as Princess Elizabeth the Duchess of Edinburgh, which I find is something often forgotten about her now. Their first child, Prince Charles, was born by caesarean section at Buckingham Palace less than a year later, on the 14th of November 1948. He was joined by his sister, Princess Anne, on the 15th of August 1950. Thankfully for Princess Elizabeth, by the time of Charles's arrival, the tradition of having a politician or politicians at the birth had been abandoned. When in London, the family lived at Clarence House, but thanks to Philip's naval career, the couple, minus their children, spent a considerable amount of time in Malta between 1949 and 1951, where the princess was able to live an almost normal life, or at least as close to it as she would ever get. Royal duty still called though, and in early 1952, with the king's health failing, the princess and the duke undertook what was intended to be a royal tour of Australia and New Zealand in his stead. It was to begin though with a holiday in Kenya, and so it was there, on the 6th of February, that Elizabeth learned from her husband that her beloved father had died and that she had ascended to the throne at the age of just 25. Life now changed completely. Philip had to give up his job in the Navy and the family moved into Buckingham Palace, though in fact the monarch and their consort rotate around several residences, and part of the year is also spent at Windsor Castle, at Sandringham in Norfolk, and at Balmoral in Scotland. The new Queen's paternal grandmother, the Dowager Queen Mary, wife of George V, died on the 24th of March 1953, and so she just missed her granddaughter's coronation. This took place at Westminster Abbey on the 2nd of June and was one of the great episodes of royal pageantry during the 21st century, helped in no small part by the fact that it was televised, the first time a coronation had been so. In later years, Elizabeth looked back on that day and commented that the imperial state crown was very heavy and very uncomfortable to wear. Soon, she and Philip were off on a 7-month tour of the Commonwealth, and she became the first reigning monarch to visit Australia and New Zealand. She received a rapturous welcome, and it has been estimated that 3/4 of Australia's population came out to see her. You can see some of the engagements they fulfilled and the crowds who turned out for them in these pictures. These duties came at a price, though. The couple didn't take their children with them on this lengthy tour, and so the family were separated for the duration of it. It would only be in the next generation that very young royals would accompany their parents on foreign trips, and never on ones as long as this. The start of the reign was also marked by Princess Margaret's desire to marry Group Captain Peter Townshend, who she'd been involved with for several years, though the exact point at which their relationship began is still a little unclear. He was divorced, and though the Queen wanted her sister to be happy, she was required under the 1772 Royal Marriages Act to give her formal permission for the union to occur, yet she felt unable, given her position as head of the Church of England, to do so. The situation dragged on until October 1955, when Margaret announced that she would not marry Townshend after all, though interestingly, documents released in 2004 show that efforts were underway to amend the 1772 Act so that the Queen wouldn't have to give her permission, and presumably Princess Margaret knew this, so perhaps the romance had already cooled by that stage. She later wed Anthony Armstrong-Jones in 1960, who was created Earl of Snowdon. As the Queen settled into life as the monarch, the pattern of her royal duties took shape. Almost every day of her reign, red boxes full of official documents for her to read and sign were delivered to her, containing all sorts of state secrets, and until the later stages of her life, she would attend an average of 400 official engagements in the UK every year. There were also nearly 300 foreign trips to countries all over the world, including this one to the United States, a country she visited many times. She even became the first British monarch to address the US House of Congress in 1991. Other notable trips included those to China in 1986 and Russia in 1994, as in both cases she was the first reigning British monarch to go to those countries. A trip to the Republic of Ireland in 2011, which I can personally recall, was also a great success, and her decision to make gestures such as wearing green and speaking a few words of Irish at a dinner held here in St Patrick's Hall in Dublin Castle went down a storm, with the trip as a whole helping to improve the historically difficult relations between the two countries. She also welcomed foreign dignitaries to the UK and met many of the most famous personages of the 20th and 21st centuries, including all the US presidents of her reign except Lyndon Johnson. Here we see her with President Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline in 1961, and with one of his successors, President Reagan, and his wife Nancy, who you see here at Windsor Castle in 1982. The Queen and the President even famously went horseback riding in Windsor Park, giving the waiting press a much more relaxed and unusual photo op than was usually the case during such visits. There were state openings of Parliament to be undertaken too, lots of trees to be planted, annual Christmas messages to be given, this was a tradition begun by her grandfather, garden parties to be hosted at Buckingham Palace, and over 4,000 honours such as knighthoods and damehoods to be conferred. In the midst of all this were weekly meetings with the incumbent Prime Minister, beginning with Sir Winston Churchill. These were always strictly private, and as one of her last Prime Ministers, Theresa May, would say, they were the only meeting the PM could have where they knew there was no chance of its contents being leaked. The Queen's family expanded too, with the birth of Prince Andrew in 1960 and Prince Edward in 1964. Although their mother was nearly always very busy, whilst conducting research for this video and listening to her children talk about her, I noted that all four were at pains to emphasise what a good mother she was, and how many happy memories they have of holidays in Scotland and on the Royal Yacht Britannia. Charles has commented that, quote, "I was very lucky to have her as a mother," while Princess Anne said that it was on Britannia that the Queen, quote, "was the most relaxed and was the furthest away from the pressures of the job and the state." The yacht was retired in 1997, much to the Queen's sadness. It was one of the few times she was seen welling up in public, and is now docked in Edinburgh, where you can visit it and see the Queen's onboard rooms. Speaking just for myself, I have to say that I found it well worth a visit. As the 20th century progressed, there were efforts to modernise the family image, with a camera team being allowed to film them at work for a 1969 documentary. However, the Queen quickly decided that it had been a mistake to allow such access and had the documentary banned from being shown again after the early 1970s. It was leaked on YouTube in 2021, however, and as of the recording of this video, remains there. This foray into modernisation may have been a false start, but other efforts were more successful, and the modern royal walkabouts were started in the 1970s and have remained popular ever since. There were some standout moments during the 60s and 70s though, some good, some bad. When a colliery spoil tip collapsed in the Welsh mining village of Aberfan in 1966, leading to an avalanche of spoil landing on the village and claiming the lives of 144 people, including 116 children, the Queen's decision, taken partly on the advice of her staff, not to visit for 8 days was something she later regretted, and she made a point of going back to the village several more times during her reign. She was always welcome there, and one survivor later said that he thought she had made the correct decision not to come earlier after the disaster, because the entourage that would have arrived with her would have distracted from the rescue efforts. Another event, which we still feel the repercussions of today, though probably hardly anyone thinks about it, was the decimalisation of British currency in 1971. This meant that all old coins and notes were withdrawn from use, and from that point on, Elizabeth has been the only monarch whose face appears on British money, just as it appears on stamps. In May 1972, her uncle, the former Edward VIII, died in France and was buried in England. And it is interesting to think that had he not abdicated, but still had no children, it was only at this point in her mid-40s that Elizabeth would have become queen, instead of ascending to the throne 20 years earlier. In 1973, the first of her children married, when her daughter Anne wed Captain Mark Phillips. But tragedy was only narrowly averted the following year when there was a failed attempt to kidnap the princess, during which her bodyguard, driver, a police officer and a journalist were all shot protecting her, though fortunately all recovered. Anne made her mother a grandmother for the first time in 1977 and again in 1981, and there were huge celebrations in 1977 for the Queen's Silver Jubilee, marking her 25 years on the throne. In a speech given on the occasion, she harked back to the vow of service she had made on her 21st birthday, saying that despite her youth when she had made it, quote, "I do not retract nor regret one word of it." She would need that sense of steel for the trials that were still to come. Princess Margaret divorced her husband in 1978, an unheard of move and a huge scandal at the time, and much worse than that, that same year Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was the Queen's distant cousin and Prince Philip's uncle and a long-term mentor to both him and Prince Charles, was murdered by the IRA during a family holiday in the Republic of Ireland. Despite these heartbreaks and setbacks though, as the 1980s dawned, things seemed to be looking up, especially when Prince Charles married the wildly popular Lady Diana Spencer. The 1981 marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales was dubbed a fairy tale by commentators at the time, and it seemed to be so from the outside, with the couple welcoming 2 children, Princes William and Harry, in 1982 and 1984 respectively. Unfortunately, it soon transpired that they weren't in fact very well suited to one another, and Charles was still involved with Camilla Parker Bowles, who he dated in the 1970s. The Queen could do little but watch as their marriage fell apart, and in 1992 their separation was announced. Elizabeth II was often noted for her quiet composure and generally unruffled nature, and this was apparent during several incidents in the early 80s. In 1982, a man shot what turned out to be blanks at her in London during the Trooping of the Colour ceremony on the Mall, but the Queen stayed calm, controlled her horse, and carried on with the ceremony. The following year, she awoke in her room in Buckingham Palace to find a strange man had entered it, but again stayed remarkably calm in what must have been a very alarming situation, and kept him talking until she was able to summon help. Her composure was frequently tested during the 1990s, which saw some of the most difficult times she would face as Queen. As well as the ending of the Waleses' marriage, Prince Andrew's marriage to Sarah Ferguson, which had begun in 1986, also finished in 1992. And though Princess Anne had been separated from her husband since 1989, it was likewise in 1992 that their divorce was finalised. To top it all off, Windsor Castle, one of the Queen's favourite homes, was heavily damaged by fire in November on her 45th wedding anniversary, and a row quickly erupted over who would pay for the repairs. Soon afterwards, Her Majesty famously remarked that she had had an annus horribilis, Latin for a horrible year. Even worse was to come, though. With Charles and Diana separated, they embarked on a highly damaging war of words, dubbed the Wars of the Waleses by the press, and in December 1995, the Queen wrote to them urging them to divorce, which they did the following year. Then, on the 31st of August 1997, the unthinkable happened, when the princess, aged just 36, was killed in a car crash in Paris. When the news came of Diana's death, the Queen was at Balmoral with other members of the family, including her grandsons William and Harry, and opted to stay there for 4 days to be with them. It was perhaps the only time in her reign when she put her family first in this way, but she took an enormous amount of criticism for it in the press, who accused her of not caring about the princess. When she did return to London, though, she walked amongst the crowds outside Buckingham Palace to the sound of applause, and made a rare televised speech to the nation, these usually only occurred at Christmas, in which she paid tribute to Diana as a person and a mother. When her former daughter-in-law's coffin passed by the front of the palace on the day of her funeral, Queen Elizabeth bowed her head to the woman many had dubbed the Queen of Hearts, after a comment made by Diana in a TV interview. As the new millennium dawned, the public image of the Queen and the royal family improved again. Prince Edward married Sophie Rhys-Jones in 1999 and is the only one of Elizabeth's children never to divorce. In early 2002, there was great sympathy for the Queen's loss, within just a few weeks of each other, of her sister Princess Margaret and her mother. This was followed soon after by huge celebrations and an outpouring of love and support for her to mark her Golden Jubilee. 3 years later, in 2005, her eldest son married Camilla Parker Bowles. Though the Queen and Prince Philip didn't attend the actual ceremony, they went to the religious blessing later in the day and accepted their new daughter-in-law, known as the Duchess of Cornwall, into the family, as did Princess Diana's sons. She and the Duke of Edinburgh became great-grandparents in 2010 when their eldest grandchild, Peter Phillips, became a father, and in 2011 Prince William married Catherine Middleton, becoming the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. In 2012, Elizabeth became only the second monarch in British history to have a Diamond Jubilee, as she celebrated 60 years on the throne. And when the Olympics came to London that year, she showed off her sense of humour and delighted millions by taking part in a pre-recorded skit with actor Daniel Craig, in character as James Bond, in which she made it appear that she had parachuted into the opening ceremony. The following year, the Cambridges' first child, Prince George, was born, and the Queen was in the unusual position of having 3 direct heirs all alive at the same time as her. By that point, Her Majesty had also witnessed the overturning of the ancient law of male primogeniture, which places boys ahead of girls in the line of succession, so that as of 2011, it now descends based on seniority. In September 2015, the Queen became the longest reigning British monarch ever, surpassing the record set by her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, who had become Queen at 18, 7 years younger than Elizabeth had been. In fact, the only person in history that we know of who has reigned longer than her was Louis XIV of France, who reigned for 72 years, but who ascended to his throne at the age of 4, which gave him a bit of an advantage in that arena. As Elizabeth entered her 90s, she continued to work for her country, though she did increasingly delegate some of her tasks to younger members of her family, especially Princes Charles and William. Prince Philip retired from public duty in the summer of 2017 at the age of 96, the same year the couple celebrated their platinum wedding anniversary. And had she been a quote-unquote normal person, Elizabeth too would have been enjoying her retirement for decades already. Instead, as it turned out, the last 5 years of her life contained some of its most dramatic moments. In 2018, Prince Harry married the American actress Meghan Markle. It was a joyous occasion for the family, and most people welcomed the addition to the firm, as the royal family is known, as well as their first child, a son named Archie, who was born the following year. However, by the end of 2019, it was clear that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex were unhappy in their lives within this unique family business. Although they hoped initially to take only a more backseat role within the family, the Queen felt unable to facilitate this, and instead, in early 2020, they withdrew from their lives as working royals, stopped using their HRH titles, and moved to North America. Comparisons were inevitably made to Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, and sadly something of a rift developed between the Sussexes and some of the family. But the Queen wished them both well and emphasised that they remained much-loved members of the family. In an interview with Oprah Winfrey in 2021, in which the Sussexes criticised various other royals, both were careful not to say anything negative about the Queen, and instead sang her praises, even naming their daughter Lilibet, who was born a few months later, after her great-grandmother. The late 2010s and early 2020s were also made more difficult for the Queen due to legal problems faced by her second son, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, who was accused of serious sexual offences against a then teenaged girl in the early 2000s, and who eventually had to withdraw from public life and stop using his HRH title after a disastrous TV interview given to the BBC at the end of 2019. He reached an out-of-court settlement with his accuser in 2022, amid suggestions that his mother may have helped to fund the compensation that he had agreed to pay. One of the greatest challenges of the Queen's final 2 years came with the COVID-19 pandemic, which took hold of the UK in March 2020, forcing the country into an unprecedented series of lockdowns and killing thousands. In one of her rare televised statements outside of her Christmas broadcasts, she spoke to the country from Windsor Castle, where she and the Duke of Edinburgh were isolated with a skeletal staff. The Queen thanked those working within the NHS and reassured her people that by standing together, the United Kingdom would come through the disaster and that good times would return, when those separated from their loved ones would meet with them again. She was right, of course. The country and the world did come through the worst of the pandemic, normal life did resume, and over the next 2 years, the Queen continued with her official duties, sometimes carrying them out remotely, sometimes, when lockdowns permitted, in person. In 2021, however, she suffered the last great loss of her reign, when her husband of over 73 years, Prince Philip, passed away at the age of 99. With social distancing rules still in place, the funeral at St George's Chapel at Windsor was a small affair, with only 30 mourners allowed, and the abiding image was of the Queen, sitting alone in a pew, mourning the man she once called my strength and stay all these years. 2022 marked the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, celebrating a mammoth 70 years on the throne, an achievement unlikely ever to be equalled. Though now increasingly frail and suffering from mobility issues, she made what would be her final appearance on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with her immediate family, and delighted the world by taking part in a skit with none other than Paddington Bear, in which she revealed the contents of her handbag, a marmalade sandwich if you're interested. On the 6th of September, she welcomed her 15th Prime Minister, Liz Truss, into office during a meeting at Balmoral Castle, and was pictured standing and smiling in front of the fireplace in one of her living rooms. Just 2 days later, reports emerged from Buckingham Palace that her doctors were concerned for her health, and soon many senior royals were rushing to Scotland if they weren't there already. Queen Elizabeth II died on the afternoon of the 8th of September with her eldest 2 children by her side and at the age of 96. Her remains stayed at the castle, resting in an oak coffin in its ballroom until the 11th of September, when they were taken to Edinburgh to lie in Holyrood Palace, then on to St Giles's Cathedral in the city on the 12th. They were then flown to London on the 13th and placed overnight in Buckingham Palace, before being taken in procession to Westminster Hall on the 14th, to lie in state ahead of her funeral at Westminster Abbey on the 19th and interment alongside her husband, sister and parents in St George's Chapel, Windsor. Across the United Kingdom and other parts of the world, tributes flooded in, flags flew at half-mast, and flowers were laid in memory of one of history's most extraordinary people, a little girl who was never born to be queen, but who I think will give her name to an era and be credited with presiding over a second great Elizabethan age. It's impossible to briefly or adequately sum up such an extraordinary life, but I think above all else Queen Elizabeth II will be remembered for the incredible sense of duty and love she always showed towards her country, in good times and in bad, and for how much of herself she gave to it. She will be deeply missed, not just by her family and personal friends, but by countless millions around the world who looked up to her and loved her. After nearly a century of service, I hope we can agree that there are few people who have ever deserved more than she to rest in peace. I hope you've enjoyed this retrospective of her incredible life. I'll be back next week with a new video, and until then, keep learning.